Hello and welcome to a presentation by Søren Flink Mitko on reaction qualifications, discrimination, and paternalism. My name is Alex Madva, and I'm director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy and co-director of the Digital Humanities Consortium in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences at Cal Poly Pomona. We're very excited to sponsor today's event in collaboration with CPP's Philosophy Department and the Philosophy Club. Dr. Mitko is Associate Professor of Political Science in the Center for the Experimental Philosophical Study of Discrimination at Aarhus University in Denmark. He specializes in moral and political theory, including work on paternalism, discrimination, inequalities, experimental philosophy, and global justice. Before I hand things over to Dr. Mitko, I wanted to let people know to mark their calendars now. For the next big event CCP is going to be hosting this fall, which is an election fair on Friday, October 11th, in collaboration with the Office of Government and External Affairs, the Digital Humanities Consortium, and various student groups, including the History Club and the Student Initiative for Justice. It'll be a day-long event with guest speakers specializing in community organizing and election registration. We're going to host a table fair during lunch featuring representatives running for local office and campaigning for various ballot initiatives. And we'll conclude with opportunities for students to phone bank, text bank, or translate election materials into different languages. So I hope to see you there. To stay up to date on everything we've got planned, please sign up for our mailing list and follow us on the socials, Instagram, the website formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitko. Okay.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much for having me. Is this on? I think it is. Yeah, good. Yeah, I'm excited to be here and to talk about my paper on.
Yeah. Actually, I think it's not on. I think we have.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here, and my understanding is that I'm giving a lecture on this topic and my recent paper on this work. And feel free to interrupt during the lecture if you have some clarificatory question, and then afterwards we can go into the more sort of substantial. Yeah, then we have it again. So, as Alex told you, I'm working, one of my areas of specialization is paternalism, that is policies, actions that cater to people's good, but in ways in which people are often reluctant to accept. So that would be, for example, tobacco regulation, in which we say this type of activity is not good for you. We are regulating it in order to cater to your welfare. And in some cases, you might be adverse to the fact that tobacco is more expensive. But we are overriding this reluctance on your part because we think it's for your own good. And of course, there are many objections to paternalism. I'll return to some of them today. But of course, some would say that it's infringing people's autonomy to not let them decide for themselves how to run their own life. Or after all, for example, tobacco smoking, if we focus on the health issue, it affects the person, him or herself. Why should the state or others interfere? So that's one of the issues, and it will definitely play a big role today, the paternalism part. I should, as a side, say that I'm interested and have been interested in and written about paternalism also, not only between the state and then individuals, but also between private individuals. Some think that paternalism is less problematic if it's between intimate partners, for example, and I have discussed that issue. Today, I'm then combining this with my other interest, which is discrimination and especially sort of job discrimination or discrimination at the job market and how people are selected for positions and jobs in the market, and how certain qualifications might be problematic to count. And that is what I will tell you about in a moment, about reaction qualifications. And finally, regarding my kind of type of work, I should say that as Alex also mentioned, it's important that for the center I'm a part of, that we are combining it with empirical work, sort of attempts to see what the public thinks about ethical issues, and trying to incorporate that in the philosophical doctrines. And I'm both interested in how public opinions or public views should influence theories in political theories, how they should be revised in view of public opinions that might be in tension with the philosophical doctrines. And I have also done direct work on this question of reaction qualifications in a sort of empirical work where I, together with colleagues, try to look at people's opinions on this question of reaction qualification. But let me get into the question about reaction qualification, because that's not a common term. It's a technical term, and it's important to flesh that out so we know what we're talking about. And it's in a quite old article, but still important, by Alan Wertheimer. He coins this term reaction qualification. So you can think of qualifications in the sort of standard intuitive way, something that makes a person fit to do a certain job. But then it turns out that these qualifications are in one way sort of actual and obvious qualifications, but in another way they raise some special problems, as we will see in a moment. But according to Wertheimer, reaction qualifications, they refer to those abilities or characteristics which contribute to job effectiveness by causing or serving as the basis of the appropriate reactions in the recipients, whereas technical qualifications refer to all other qualifications of an ordinary sort. And one example of a reaction qualification would be, for example, a teacher's accents. Say that you pick up on my accents and say this is, say I'm going to teach one of your classes, and you feel, well, this is not, I'm not used to that accent, and it's given that accent, I have difficulties perceiving, or it's not as, I would prefer another accent. That would be a sort of reaction qualification, because it is something that you react to the tone of my voice or to my accent. So that's one type of reaction qualification. Another type of reaction qualification that I have been working on is related to people's appearances. Say that I have a small facial tattoo, and some customers, clients take offense or think they would prefer to be served by a person without tattoos. That would be a sort of reaction qualification. And the question is whether this should count against a candidate for a job if this person has a facial tattoo. And that's actually what we tested empirically, what people thought about this qualification. But here I'm just, you can ask me about these results later, but here I'm just using it as a sort of example of a reaction qualification. Because even though this person has a tattoo, this might not affect the person's technical qualification in terms of serving coffee or doing other kind of work, but it affects this person's qualifications in the sense that it might affect the interaction between this person and then clients, customers that might feel bad about this tattoo or would prefer a person without this feature. But on a first approximation, there's a tight connection, and I noted this idea that there is in a way, it is a qualification, if just as a first step, how a candidate, how an employee interacts with customers, clients, because after all, this is part of a job to interact with, or many jobs to interact with clients and customers. So on a first approximation, there's a tight connection between meritocracy, that is a basic norm of hiring the best qualified candidates, or at least not hiring a candidate that is less qualified than others. And then anti-discrimination. Good. Yeah, so on a first approximation, there's a tight connection between hiring, or a standard or norm of hiring the best qualified candidate and anti-discrimination, and in that connection, counting reaction qualification as a part of meritocracy. Yet, if you count reaction qualification as a part of meritocracy, or as a part of what qualifies a candidate, this connection becomes tenuous. It might be that we are sort of integrating aspects of discrimination in our selection of candidates if we pay attention to reaction qualifications. To exemplify, Michael Blake mentions the case of the Jacksonville Beach Chamber of Commerce, voted in 1953 to officially ban integrated baseball within the confines of the city. And then in defense of this decision, the spokesman stated, for example, that it is just that the patrons of the team felt they would rather have an all-white team, end quote. So what I'm trying to communicate with this example is that if we take it to be a qualification how people react to certain features of a given candidate, then in some cases, some reactions might be reactions to people's race, people's gender, people's appearance, and then we risk including in our grounds for ascertaining a candidate what we would ordinarily say is discrimination. So that's the challenge with reaction qualifications, that if we consider them as qualifications, then we might have a tension with discrimination. Then we might build in to our standards discriminatory ways of selecting candidates. There are three strategies. I'm not going to go too far into these. These are somewhat technical, but it's just, and strategies here, I mean how to go about this question of reaction qualifications, given that there's this tension or this problem that we could integrate discrimination in our selection of candidates. One is that we shouldn't count any reaction qualifications. That seems wrong, because in many cases, for example, take people's reactions to whether or not a candidate is polite or not. Many would say this is an important qualification of in some lines of business, that the candidate is polite and welcoming or something like that, or agreeable. So it seems that to many jobs, how recipients, how customers react is part of a person's qualification. So it seems wrong to exclude reaction qualifications as such. The second approach is to count every reaction qualification. That is, even reaction qualification based on race, for example, gender, appearance, and then say this is a part of a candidate's qualification. It counts, so we count every kind of reaction qualification. So that would be the non-moralized view, that we are not selecting between these different qualifications, we're simply counting all of them, and this establishes what merit is. But then we can have other principles that weigh against merit and say that merit shouldn't win out every time. Sometimes it's cancelled out by other principles. That could be principles of distributive justice or principles of gender equality. So that's the second strategy. And then the third strategy is what we call the moralized view, which is that we are selecting some qualification and saying these are legitimate qualifications, and here are some qualifications that are illegitimate. So we need some kind of standard, some moral standard for saying which qualifications are okay to count and which are not okay to count. And for example, the empirical example I mentioned, we asked people whether it was okay to not hire a person with a facial tattoo, and we tested, for example, whether it was legitimate, or people found it to be legitimate, if this person had gotten their tattoo voluntarily, which is of course the case in nearly all of the case that people have chosen to get a tattoo. It's not sort of universally the case. It could be sort of a cultural thing or a tribal tattoo that a person got in a certain context, but typically it's something that the person can affect by choosing or not choosing to have this feature. And then one example of it being more legitimate or perhaps being unproblematic to count reaction qualifications would be if it's something that the candidate can affect by choosing one way or the other, because then it's avoidable, this disadvantage, if the person is not being rejected. But there are a lot to say about it. It's just one criterion, the choice criterion, which is invoked. And another criterion would be that, well, it might be the case that how we appear, how we express ourselves is very important to us, and it might be unfair to be discounted for a certain job on the basis of something that is important to us. So that would be a sort of not a factor that we could build in. Is this an important part of people's self-expression? And then it might be more problematic to discount people on this basis. And there are plenty of these kind of ways of trying to select between legitimate and illegitimate reaction qualifications. And what I want to say here is that this would, on the moralized view, then it would be a way of simply filtering the qualifications that are legitimate from those who are illegitimate. And I mentioned some criterions on the basis of which one might do that. Following Wertheimer, a number of scholars, including Kasper Lippert Rasmussen, our center leader, the leader of the center I'm part of, Andy Mason and David Miller, they have developed theories about which reaction qualifications to count and which not. And I, in my talk, I rely on a third moralized strategy. So that would be the third one, where we select between qualifications, and we say that there are certain qualifications that count. So when we define merit, it's defined by these reaction qualifications. So we select certain qualifications as the appropriate qualifications. I also adopt a so-called symmetrical stance on which reaction qualifications to count. In brief, the idea is that negative reaction to qualifications that are based on anti-meritocratic attitudes ought not to count. So we are trying to define anti-meritocratic attitudes and then saying that these attitudes should not count. And the trick here is to define them in the following way, that is anti-meritocratic attitudes. They are defined through anti-meritocratic choices in the hand of selectors. And selectors here are employers or those who are employing a candidate. So an attitude is anti-meritocratic if and only if it is such that if a selector decides between candidates influenced by it, the decision is not based solely on merit, end quote. So the idea here is to take the cue from what we would find anti-meritocratic if a selector or an employer makes a choice of a candidate. And for example, if an employer says, I don't want people with a certain color of skin on my baseball team, this would be a clear case of anti-meritocratic attitude. And then what we're saying is that we can take our cue from that and say that those kind of attitudes are also problematic if they are the attitudes that are behind the reactions of the recipients. So these reactions ought not to count. So the symmetry is between the kind of standards that selectors endorse and then the kind of attitudes and standards that recipients endorse. And this is one way of trying to avoid this tension between meritocracy and discrimination by saying that reaction qualifications that reflect attitudes that are anti-meritocratic should not count. So that's the idea here. Then how is my argument contributing to this literature? There are many issues about sort of battles between different theories about what should be selected as legitimate reaction qualification, and I have given one account that I sort of endorse or use in this paper, that symmetric view that I just noted. So how am I attacking this issue or contributing to this issue in my paper? Yeah, I see my contribution here as a supplement to the symmetrical view. In a nutshell, I show that, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, there's a compelling paternalistic argument for not counting reaction qualifications that are based on anti-meritocratic attitudes, that is, for using the symmetrical view. And I say this is surprising because one might think that people often have an interest in exactly such attitude being counted. However, I shall go on to show that that people have what I shall refer to as important moral interest. So I believe that people have a moral interest in certain reaction qualifications not being counted, and that we can induce or motivate or make people act in accordance with these moral interests, and that it will be something that caters to their well-being in a certain sense. So I'm arguing that not counting reaction qualifications that reflect anti-meritocratic attitudes is a benefit to people. So it's a benefit in the sense that they are acting in accordance with standards that are good for them to act in accordance with. That's the sort of gist of the argument. You might then ask, what is the motivation, the relevance of my argument? And I would say that it's important to show that this interest in reaction qualifications not being counted is a weighty one, something that is capable of outweighing other considerations. Because, for example, an employer might say, well, I'm not biased, I'm not racist, but it's important for my shop to cater to the interest of my customers. I'm just acting as the customers want me to act in the way that they are searching for certain types of candidates, and I'm just responding to that. I'm not a racist, I'm not biased myself. And the person has a clear sort of financial interest or profit interest in acting in that way. So in order to argue that this interest is less important than other interest, I'm trying to bolster the sort of moral argument. So it's not only a case of justice concern that certain reaction qualifications should not be counted. It's also something that in a certain sense is good for the people who we ask not to count these reaction qualifications, even though it might be bad for them prudentially speaking or in a narrow sort of financial way. I'm going to suggest that living and acting in accordance with meritocratic norms is good for people, and to the extent that they are not acting in accordance with it, we can paternalize them, we can cater to their good by making them act in accordance with meritocratic norms. That's the sort of gist of the argument. And in general, I bring paternalism to bear on the question of reaction qualifications in a way it has not been introduced before. There is some related work in the literature by Urakov, who talks about perfectionism, that some reactions are more important than others, and that's that my work is in part inspired by that. So to bring up front my argument as such, I'm trying to, it's not a very formalized paper, but I'm trying to sort of state it with premises and or two premises and a conclusion, and then I will explain how I try to establish the various premises and how the conclusion follows from these premises. So the general argument goes as follows, and general here means that it applies to all of the main actors or groups of actors in the realm of reaction qualifications. Premise 1, if X has reasonable belief to the effect that interfering in Y's affairs is likely to promote Y's interest considerably, and the inference in question is limited or proportional considering the interest at stake, then X has a defeasible reason for undertaking the intervention in question. So this is, as I will return to, a basic paternalistic principle that sometimes, if we can cater enough to people's well-being, and we can do so without limiting their liberty in an intolerable way, then this is sometimes permissible. And then in premise 2, I say that X sometimes has reasonable belief to the effect that interfering in the affairs of Y is likely to promote important moral interest of Y, and that some such interference might be limited or proportional. Hence, the conclusion, X sometimes has defeasible reason for interfering in the affairs of Y. Just to give an example that might help understand this, this notion of paternalism and an paternalistic argument, that would be a classic case of crash helmets, for example, that have been much discussed. One argument is that we are really benefiting people by making it more likely that they are wearing a crash helmet when they go on a motorbike. And the limitations of their liberty might be considered limited. They can still go on the motorbike and still, in that way, pursue something that is important to them. I'm not as such endorsing the argument here, but actually I do find it compelling. There is a compelling paternalistic case for crash helmets. But here I'm just making it to sort of illustrate the kind of argument that we are using, and that I want to use here in a completely different context. And this is where I should not, or should be careful not to get into too much theoretical discussion about paternalism, because this is, as I mentioned, one of my my research area. But here I'm just sketching the kind of argument, and I have just exemplified with one sort of argument, or one paternalistic argument. But basically, paternalism is an interference or meddling. It involves coercion, shaping. It might even just be persuasion. That's controversial, but some kind of persuasion could be controversial if it's made in a certain context or recurrently and so on. So it involves some kind of meddling. It has, secondly, the intention to benefit the person who is paternalized, and the person is somewhat resistant or is not consenting to the interference in question. That's paternalism. Perfectionist paternalism is paternalism that is characterized by the conditions 1 to 3, and then it's based on a certain conception of the good, saying, for example, it is not worth it. It is not worth the risk going fast on a motorbike, even though you might, or you definitely will feel the wind in your hair more by going on without a helmet. It's not worth it. That would be a perfectionist idea, saying you're sort of discounting too much the risk and are not attentive enough to the risk involved. So many types, I would actually say, what is called hard paternalism is perfectionist paternalism. And as I have already indicated, many find that there is, at least in one sense, something morally problematic about paternalism. And so it's wrong in at least one sense. And it's wrong. And that's a big battle amongst paternalist scholars. What exactly is wrong? I indicate the most popular one. That would be, you're infringing a person's autonomy. It's after all, it's my life. The paternalized person could say, if I want to go fast on a motorbike without a crash helmet, who are you to sort of interfere in my life? That would be the sort of standard account of the wrongness of paternalism. I'm endorsing one that is not incompatible with that sort of autonomy-based one, but that is more specific in the sense that it says it's not for you to intervene in this certain act. It's simply back off or butt off. It's my life. You're sort of overstepping a boundary where I have the right to decide for myself. And I'm endorsing this. We can talk more about this in the Q&A, but I'm endorsing this view vis-a-vis a very popular view in the literature, account of the wrongness of paternalism, which claims that what is wrong about paternalism is that it's sort of questioning the capacity of the person who are making choices, and that we are sort of indicating that this person is not able to make choices for him or herself. But my view is that there are counterexamples such that it might be paternalistic, even though I'm not sort of indicating anything about your lack of competence. It might not be what is actually insulting about paternalism. Say that I'm very bad at making choices in my love life, and I have a friend that that interferes in this matter. For example, blocks a letter from a bad romantic interest of mine, such as to make it the case in that that this person don't want to be involved with me anymore, and that supposedly should be good for me. So the friend is sort of acting out of my out of concern with my interest. And in that case, I would consider that very paternalistic, in the sense that I would say, this is not for you to interfere in my love life. We can talk about it, and you know about my bad decision making in this area, and we can discuss this, and you can help me in various ways. But you cannot sort of, it's not for you to sort of step in and actually block or directly interfere in my decision making. And that's not because I'm good at making these decisions. I know this, and you know this, but still, it's not for you to. You're overstepping a boundary, and that's what is, in one sense, wrong with paternalism. But on the other side of paternalism, because now I have been going on about the badness of paternalism, so you could ask me, why should we not just simply refrain from being paternalistic? And many people, anti-paternalists, believe that's the case, but part of my research has actually involved pushing back against this idea in various ways, and saying that at least sometimes paternalism is justifiable. And you might ask, why is that the case? And the most obvious answer is that we can sometimes benefit people profoundly by interfering. So it's wrong in one way, but on the other hand, much is at stake. And my colleague Vicky Pedersen, she argues that sometimes it is actually disrespectful not to interfere in a person's life if enough is at stake. So that's the kind of, and what I'm here talking about on this slide, I'm mentioning this balancing conception of the justification of paternalism. So it is simply the idea that on the one hand, it's definitely wrong in one sense to interfere paternalistically, but on the other hand, there might be very good reasons for doing so, and these reasons might outweigh the badness of the interference. And that's the kind of argument that I'm also relying on here, this balancing conceptions. So this brings me to an account of the candidates. So just to make sure, what I'm doing now is I'm establishing the premises that important interests are at stake. So there's important benefit. We can benefit people in important ways in this area. That's and I'm doing this by appealing to the interest of the key agents in the realm of reaction qualifications. Candidates' interest includes self-realization, the idea that we have important integrity interest, that is to have the opportunity to pursue jobs, to be selected for jobs on a fair basis. So that's basically what Rawls called careers open to talent, or a fair equality of opportunity, that we have an interest in being able to pursue our plans, and to exercise our talents in attractive jobs. I also think that we have a fairness interest, that is that it's being allocated on a fair basis, such that we are praised on the basis of what we are actually doing, and not praised in ways that are excessive of what we are capable of. So we have an interest in opportunities, but also in fair opportunities. Furthermore, we have an interest in acting in accordance with an end state norm that require of each of us to do our bit to bring about a state of affairs in which first selectors fill position with someone who is no less well qualified for the position than any other candidates. And second, that recipients do not respond to candidates on anti-meritocratic grounds. So that's basically an extension of this idea that we have an interest in being assessed fairly and have fair opportunities. Then more generally, we have an interest in fairness or in a society directed in accordance with meritocratic norms. So that's the candidate's interest. Then we have selectors' interests. First of all, they have an interest that are in accordance with the candidate's interest. That is this end-state norm, a meritocratic end-state norm. That is the candidate's interest. And second, and related, selectors, they ought, and I think that's important by selectors because they are the ones who respond to customers, clients' attitudes. So they ought not to contribute to cause additional harm to people who are already unjustly worse off, and that might include candidates that are not selected on the basis, for example, of race, gender, or other characteristics. Third, they have an agent relative duty of non-collaboration, and this could be fleshed out in the following way. It enjoins selectors to offer positions to candidates who are best qualified when reaction qualifications rooted in anti-meritocratic attitudes are disregarded. So what we can say here is that selectors, assuming that they are not discriminatory or racist themselves, they should not condone the anti-meritocratic or the attitudes, the discriminatory attitudes of clients. They should not collaborate with these attitudes. That's the idea, and I endorse here and draw on what Shauna Schifrin talks about, avoiding complicity, that we have a sort of interest in avoiding being complicit in a wrong. And I'm also using a recent argument that we have weighty moral interest, and that is if we are thinking about, or one way of accounting for this is if we're thinking about what is important for how a life goes, then partly it is important that a person is not engaged in wrongdoing. It taints a person's life to be engaged in wrongdoing, and we want to push back against that. So if we want to benefit a person, we want to avoid this person being engaged in wrongdoing. And here the recipients are engaged in, the selectors are engaged in wrongdoing if they give into or condone the anti-meritocratic attitudes of recipients. Recipients, they also, as the third group, has an interest in acting in accordance with a meritocratic end-state norm. Second, they have associational interest, that is, interest in associating with others, and in this case, it's associating with candidates who have certain characteristics, and I accept that there is some legitimate interest in wanting to interact with candidates who have certain features, but I push back against the idea that we have a strong interest in, for example, associating on racial grounds with others, in engaging in private discrimination. So in that way, I believe that there is important constraints on the types of association that we can invoke here as a part of what should count in terms of recipients' interest. So they have an agent-relative recipient norm enjoining recipients not to respond to candidates on anti-meritocratic grounds. And that is, for example, racist and sexist attitudes and reactions are appropriately excluded. And just in the interest of time, I will say that I'm not going above 12 o'clock. Then I'll conclude the argument and allow for discussion. I'm keen to hear some response to my argument. So what I'm working on here, or what I've been engaged in for the last slides, is to establish the first premises that there are important moral interests in certain reaction qualifications not being counted. And these interests pertain to the three main groups of the realms of reaction qualification, that is, recipients, candidates, and selectors. They all, I argue, have important moral interest in acting in accordance with meritocratic norms. I then bolster this claim pertaining to each of the interests by invoking an argument from Ronald Dworkin's work that have been discussed less than other aspects of Dworkin's work, and that is what he calls a challenge conception. And he argues that it's a parameter of a good life that we act in accordance with just norms, that we undertake our life against the background of a just basic structure. He claims, for example, we must treat some of the circumstances in which a particular person lives as parameters that help define what a good performance of living would be for him. Second, many of our ethical parameters, they help to define the challenge that people should face. And he claims the following: if living well means responding in the right way to the right challenge, then someone's life goes worse when he cheats others for his own unfair advantage. It also goes worse when, even through no fault of his own, he lives in an unjust society, because then he cannot face the right challenge, whether he is rich with more than justice allows him to have, or poor with less. End quote. So that's an attempt to sort of bolster this idea that we have important interest in living in a society in which meritocratic norms are being respected. So that's the interest or the benefit part. People have an interest in acting in accordance with these anti-meritocratic norms, that certain reaction qualifications are not counted. And then can we interfere in a way that is not intolerably restrictive of people's liberty? And that brings us to look at the kind of intervention that could be at stake here. First, the state may prevent that anti-meritocratic attitudes materialize by prohibiting that qualification based on such attitudes are counted by selectors and others. And of course, some anti-discriminatory laws already do so. Second, and over time, the state may, by virtue of such policy, contribute to altering the underlying anti-meritocratic attitudes. It may do so by facilitating interaction between candidates and recipients, although this is initially unwanted, at least on the part of the latter. So my idea here is simply that sometimes it is good for people to be confronted with, for example, a person with a facial tattoo, learning that this person can perfectly well do the job, although clients might initially initially be adverse to interacting with this person, then it could have a sort of educational, and if I'm right, a sort of it could be good for this person in the sense that it will be in accordance with meritocratic norms, and in that way cater to this person's good. So and then that's actually the third one. The state may, through various non-coercive measures, seek to counteract such reactions. That is, they may, by campaigns and so on, try to counteract the idea or the prejudice, the sort of reluctance that people have to interacting with certain groups. For example, in Danish municipalities, some elderly people are skeptical of receiving care personnel who, for example, wears a hijab. And should we respect that kind of reaction, or should they learn that these candidates are perfectly capable of doing this work? So that's the kind of sort of policies that might be at issue. Why are these interventions relevantly limited or not intolerably interventionist? First, I argue that the volitional interest that restrictions on counting imply they are not promoted are some that people have there's the idea that some interests are not legitimate. Some interests should not be counted. So we do not have a claim to have, for example, an interest in certain discriminatory attitudes, that this is counted. This is this is simply an interest that should not be counted, is one idea. Another idea is that we could say that some valuable options, or it's only valuable options that are important to people's autonomy. So we can exclude some options without this detracting from the value of people's autonomy. Okay, so just to say, if you think back on this balancing argument and my example with a crash helmet, then we want on one side to establish that we can cater to people's good or their well-being, and there's an important well-being interest. And I have been trying to establish that living in a society that is characterized by meritocratic norms is good for people. It's in their interest to live in accordance in a society where such norms are abided to. So that's the sort of catering to people welfare or well-being part. And then on the other hand, you see the restrictions, the interference in people's life, that they are not being allowed, for example, to interact with certain, or they cannot sort of choose completely with whom they want to interact with. So there's an interference, and I have tried to establish that if we take into consideration how important the interests are, then the restrictions are acceptable. They are some that are acceptable in the sense that they are in one sense problematic, but they are outweighed by the benefit that is involved here. And this is why I argue that some of the restrictions that sort of cater to making it the case that certain anti-meritocratic attitudes are not counted, that they are acceptable, and some that we should endorse. So I think I actually ended there, and then we can take up some of your objections and other objections that I can that I have already noted and is in the literature. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So I have this catch box if anybody here would like to ask some questions. And folks in Zoomsville, you can type your questions in the chat, and then Charlotte will read them out for us.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting. I have a question about the interest for people to freely associate with whoever they want.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, does your view allow for us to respect, for instance, marginalized people's interest in associating with their own as a means of, self-defense or maybe even just preference? I think that, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Good. Yes is the short answer. I would allow for that, and it's not that I have a very developed view on it, but I'm endorsing what is being argued in the literature as a sort of asymmetry view that some minorities or groups that face specific challenges, that it's more permissible, or in some cases, all things considered, permissible for them to engage or have preferences for interacting with certain groups. So I think the best example, as Alex know, I also done some work on dating and whether discrimination in dating, and I embrace a similar view that in some circumstances and for some groups and some minority groups, sort of discrimination on the basis of certain racialized groups is more permissible when it comes to minorities than majorities. So, and I think I invoke similar views on this issues. Yeah. So another example actually from Wertheimer is he makes this example with in some areas in which people respond better to a black police officer than a white police officer, and that might be another example. Yeah.
By the way, we still have lots of pastries and coffee, so people here, please help yourselves. Other questions from the people who are here live?
Thank you so much for that. Super interesting. Do I have to hold this?
I mean, for the people on Zoom.
This is super awkward. All right. I don't know if this is going to be formulated very well, and I think I might know your answer, but I'm just going to ask anyway. So the view is that sometimes it's permissible to restrict whether reaction qualifications can count, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not that we ought to restrict them. Is it the weaker claim or the stronger claim?
Okay. So, So the question is whether it's just permissible not to count some reaction qualifications, or whether we should actually. Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't been completely precise about that. It's certainly my view that some reaction qualifications are impermissible to count. Yeah. So
then we
yeah.
ought to exclude them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can that be overridden by? I'm thinking of competing consequentialist considerations. So I'm imagining a case where the consequences of factoring them in might, in the end, benefit kind of the public good.
Yeah.
Right. So a case I'm thinking of is imagine that we can tap into and exploit people's implicit biases in order to better educate them about implicit bias, right? So it might be useful in that case to utilize a voice that they are more comfortable with, right? Like a able-bodied cis white guy, right? To communicate to them about their biases so that that information better lands, even though there we're very clearly exploiting the sort of reaction qualifications that are anti-meritocratic.
And just to understand the case,
me to do the implicit bias training
rather than a qualified Black woman, for example.
As a white man saying it, it seems like I'm not
because
for my own benefit. So it seems
okay. Now I get it. Yeah. So there could be sort of some epistemic discrimination, or that I sort of trust Alex more, and that might be in a consequentialist view, then all things considered acceptable. Yeah, no, that's a nice case. I think that's I don't know whether it's a satisfactory answer, but I think it's usual nowadays to say that there are few sort of absolute constraints, such that if the considerations that you sort of indicate are compelling enough, or that it contributes enough to a good cause, then it might actually be the case that some qualifications that we would otherwise be reluctant to count or have respect reasons for not counting, that they should count. No, that's a really nice case. I think I would be, I think presented with compelling cases like that, I can definitely see that this might be the case, and especially given that I partly invoke a sort of balancing consequentialist view, then I should allow for cases like that. Thank you. That's that's a nice point. Yeah.
Other folks here? Do we have anybody on Zoomsville? No. So I have a question too. So some of the students here are taking a class with me on American history and moral political thought, and we just introduced them to Isaiah Berlin's distinction between negative and positive liberty, and so some of his concerns about letting the government get involved in the positive liberty stuff is that what's going to happen if the government starts thinking that it's in the business of advancing people's moral interest and best conception of the good. And I'm super sympathetic with your project, but I think some of my students who just learned about this might be curious to hear what you think about that sort of challenge.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I do not do much about it in the paper, but what it brings to my mind is a recent nice work by David Enoch, where he argues that one conception of autonomy is of the sort of positive freedom like or style conception, where we sort of make people act in accordance with something that is in their larger interest, or squares better with an idealized notion of a good life for this person. And I can see I'm actually sort of I guess, but perhaps there's a part answer here, because I think so it's not that I necessarily reject the importance of autonomy, but it is one way to push back against people who say, well, you're infringing the people's autonomy by, for example, imposing restrictions on whether they use a crash helmet when they go on a motorbike. So in that way, and that's Enoch's distinction, he claims this is a sort of sovereignty conception of, and that would be the negative view of liberty. I'm being restricted in the sense that I will get a fine or something like that. But then I could say, on the other hand, I mean, so it's a family dispute within autonomy, because when I'm then in saying no, we should there are good reasons to have this prohibition or this mandate or this helmet mandate, then I'm actually also interested in autonomy, but it's of the kind of a positive liberty, or I can't remember what he terms the second kind of autonomy, but it is in making people act in accordance with what is sort of ideally or what is something that they have reason to act in accordance with. So I need not sort of so I'm still on autonomy ground, but that of course leaves the question that you sort of also poses, and that Berlin was very strict in saying that we are in dangerous territory when we are endorsing the sort of positive idea of autonomy. I'm less afraid of that, but and I think that with the cases in which take also smoking and other activities, I think there's a compelling case for the idea that if we restrict people's liberty, then in one sense we restrict their autonomy, but on the other hand we also promoting autonomy in very genuine and important ways.
Connor?
I guess a question that came to mind is how do you see this becoming more complicated, if it does, when you have competing cultural intermingling, or when you're dealing with less and less homogenous groups? You mentioned the example with caretakers who are Muslim, and I could see where cultural values sit. Like smoking is an easy one, but imagine a culture where smoking it may hurt you, but this is something that we do. This is something that the family does at dinner or something. I don't know. But then how do impositions of good on those people become more complicated, I guess? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I would begin by saying that I agree it definitely becomes more complicated, and I think that within paternalism and also liberty related studies, there are some good works who try to sort of take this more seriously, and I endorse that completely. So what I think is one important complication is the danger that we believe that we can cater to people's good or well-being, but we do so out of a sort of too narrow-minded conception of their considerations, and risk sort of running roughshod over their interests. So I think one response is actually to be more attentive to what people are actually saying. I think there are important studies both in terms of poverty, but also in terms of kind of choices that people make in adverse circumstances, where people try to engage more with the groups who we might want to benefit in various ways, and actually engage in more dialogue with and understand the exact nature of their concerns. So I definitely agree. It becomes more complicated, and it is sort of incumbent upon those who want to benefit these groups to be more attentive to these differences. But I think I'll leave it. And perhaps I could say that part of the one way is to engage in dialogue, but another one is also to do as we do in the center to sort of actually not only do philosophy from the armchair, but also to sort of try to do systematic studies of people's, for example, opinions regarding reaction qualification, which we have tried to do, and then sort of refine our philosophical views in light of that. But thanks for the question. Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up if that's fine. So I don't have this very clearly thought out, but I'm just wondering when you're considering, like, when you're weighing the benefits and, whatever harms might come, are you considering that just within the group that you're talking about, or is it more kind of widely societal? So the example I have in mind is kind of like related to what Katie was saying. It's like, so if you're saying we're gonna, like, it benefits the group that we're trying to like increase their knowledge or like have them associate with others, that's gonna benefit them in some way, then like that's fine. But what if we're talking about my example of like allowing a very like minority group to just, refuse to associate with others in certain ways, in certain circumstances, that could benefit them, as you were saying earlier, but overall, that doesn't really benefit society, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so would you think that like whose interests are more important
nice.
there?
Yeah, nice. I definitely would include. I'm not sure I do it explicitly in the paper, but I think one plausible constraint to include would be to say that benefits to groups who are, for various reasons, worse off than other groups count more, like a sort of prioritarian idea. Some invoke concepts of discrimination that integrates this idea. So I take it that and that might actually be one reason for the asymmetry that we talked about. That there are some groups that are sort of members of disadvantaged groups, and therefore, given that these that, for example, counting certain reaction qualifications actually benefits this group, even though it has these adverse societal consequences, given that they are initially worse off than others, this might be justifiable. I think I would invoke something like that. I guess also similar considerations are invoked in sort of affirmative action ideas. So I think I will go along that way, but it's a nice challenge. Yeah.
Let me see if I can remember the question now. I think this is maybe an empirical question, so it might just not be relevant for you, but I guess I'm thinking about the way these sort of paternalistic or the way these sorts of interventions in the workplace could have backlash effects. Where if you kind of from the top down interfere with how employers or whoever are making their selections, that this could not only be sort of bad for whatever retraining you're trying to accomplish in their like character, the good for them. It could, in the long run, be bad for whomever they hire, because the person they hire will be entering a workplace where they are not genuinely wanted, right? So I'm just wondering how backlash effects might factor into how you're thinking about this.
Yeah. I definitely acknowledge it as a important concern, and one that should be factored in when we contemplate a certain intervention. And it, as you also indicated, it is an important, or there's an important empirical element in it, sort of to assess how is it just a passing phenomenon? Can it sort of in the long term be beneficial, and these effects sort of could be reduced in force? But I definitely accept it as an important consideration, and I haven't done that much direct. I haven't focused very directly on it in the paper. One or two of my colleagues have a paper in which they look at affirmative action policies and look partly on backslash or the fact that also those who are supposedly benefited by these policies, that they might sort of they would rather be without the policies, or saying no, we don't want this kind of help. And partly for the reasons that you bring up, and then of course in that case, these policies and also my policies would be part of the paternalism of them if people, even the people who are supposedly benefited by them, and even people who are then their qualifications count more now, but perhaps they, as you say, they think that they might get a position, and others think, okay, this is because of these policies that have stipulated that this should not count, and I would rather sort of fend for myself and do it even in a skewed competition. So yeah, my best answer is that if we go with the sort of consequentialist, we should sort of assess the on the one hand the backslash, and then on the other hand the long-term benefits of the policy.
I had a question in this ballpark as well, because I had the benefit of reading a draft of your paper on this, which was really great. But I think you mentioned it today as well, but I think it comes out more strongly in the paper that you sort of think that there are several good arguments that we have to make these reaction qualifications impermissible in certain contexts, and yours kind of stands alongside the other ones. And so I'm imagining, like, if we're like putting this policy into place in a workplace, and in one scenario we just have like a very sort of simple, like our messaging about the policy is, or even when we're passing the law and we're saying like whereas, and we like cite the reasons for the law. In one case we do a very simple merit-based argument where we just say something like, the fact that someone has facial tattoos or their skin color is not like, that's not a merit-based feature. Even if some people will react better, or not, like it's still not about their merit or something like that. And so that's why we're not going to pay attention to it. And so you just keep the reasons for the policy, or that you are sort of publicly sharing in the space of reasons and public debate and public deliberation, is just focused on the merit stuff. And then another scenario where we say like, and we're doing this for your own moral good, and we're going to help you be a better moral agent. Like we're helping you be more moral this way, or something like that. That in that second scenario, people might be like, this, you might get this kind of reactive backlash thing where that, so even if it's true, it might be, empirically speaking, like strategically unwise to like play it up, because you might get these backlash effects.
Oh, great. Yeah. No, I definitely, I haven't considered that exact objection, but I can definitely see it that, so the challenge would be that instead of sort of supplementing, I mean, in some sense, it seems to supplement, in the sense that it pulls in the same direction, but it might actually deteriorate or make
it's like one reason too many or something like that.
No, that's great. and it's definitely comes down in part to how we conceive of the way in which people are benefited from.
Right.
I like to think of, when I think of it as a supplementary argument, I like to think of it in the way that we want policies that are just, that they should also sort of be attached to or be related to benefits, or to sort of what is good for the person overall. So I'm thinking in vein of both Rawls and Rousseau talks about this, that in order for a just society to survive, it should also sort of in some sense be compatible with people living good lives, and not sort of seeing justice as something that detracts from a good life. So but then it's very important how the story is told, that it sort of connects to your good, because I can see that it can be phrased in a way that you're saying that now I'm telling you this is good for you, and so I have to think more about how to handle that. I can definitely see that.
But I'm sure there are ways of like finessing the framing where it's more about it's like for the good of the community or something like that, where it sounds less like I'm telling you what to do for your own good or whatever.
No, that's really good.
All right. So I want to push a little bit on the distinction between the reaction qualifications and the, what are the other ones? Technical qualifications. So I guess I'm just wondering, and I have a vague background worry that sort of emphasizing this distinction in the like real world could have unintended consequences. So I guess I'm thinking about the way that our assessments of technical qualifications can be biased, right? So can involve the kind of identity-based or anti-meritocratic attitudes that you're concerned about on the other side. So if those are being brought to bear in the assessment of technical qualifications, then I worry that having this explicit distinction between the, what are they? Reaction qualifications and the technical ones could give us a kind of smokescreen for letting ourselves off the hook for the way bias affects the assessment of the qualifications.
Okay. That's various kind of reactions. I'm tempted to say that I definitely see and acknowledge your worry, and then this might provide a reasons for sort of just broadening these kind of considerations to include technical qualification. I think that might actually be one way to go, because I certainly, I think you're right. I mean, there are similar consideration and similar biases related to technical qualification. I mentioned in one version of the paper ideas about what people's height and stamina means. So there's some discussion in the literature about, for example, security personnel, that some would say that if you're short stature, then you cannot provide the same security. But it turns out actually often this is based on prejudice, and it's not. So is that a technical qualification? Is it a reaction qualification? But I think I would definitely take this on board, and I think my responsibility would be to sort of be open to making some of the similar consideration also to what we could call technical qualifications.
Okay, I think we're at time. So please join me in thanking Dr. Mitko.